Okay. Hi everyone, let's get started. So, good morning from Chicago as we start the second day of the Stigler Conference. As I announced yesterday briefly, this year we have something new, which are online polls where people can participate. So I'll ask you, please take a picture of this QR code if you're in the room and have some questions about yesterday's events very quickly. And if you're online, we're also going to post the poll on the YouTube chat, and then we're also gonna have it on Twitter. So take 2 minutes and give your views on what happened yesterday. I think we wanna hear your voice. While people are answering, I'll start by introducing our speakers then. So to my left, we have Elettra Bietti, who is an assistant professor of law and computer sciences within the School of Law and the Curie College of Computer Sciences at Northeastern University. She's also a faculty associate with the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University and affiliate fellow of the Information Society Project at Yale Law School. Then to the left of Elettra, we have Fiona Morton, who is a Theodore Nirenberg Professor of Economics at Yale Law School of Management. And she's also the founder and director of the Thurman Arnold's Project at Yale, a vehicle that promotes antitrust programming and policy to Yale students, among many other also qualifications. And finally, at the end of the panel, we have Maria Luisa Stasi, who leads the law and policy activities on digital markets at Article 19, which is one of the leading civil society organizations engaged in digital policy in Europe. And she also just completed her PhD in law at the University of Tilburg. So the way that we structured this panel, we have a lot to cover, is that first, Fiona is going to very briefly explain the DMA for those in the room. And if you're doing antitrust and you don't know what the DMA is, you should know what the DMA is. But anyway, we thought it would be a good way to level the playing field by having some quick remarks. Then we'll go through opening remarks in the order of Elettra, Isa, and then Fiona. And then we'll engage in the Q&A. And I will hope to open early for Q&A with everyone here. We have a great audience. So Fiona, I'll let you start quickly on giving an overview.
Okay. Thank you, Filippo. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is the cartoon simplifying the DMA. You see the gatekeepers listed down the side on the left in different colors. And then what the law does is it identifies things called core platform services. And these are the types of core platform services that the law enumerates. They're pretty self-explanatory except for intermediation. Intermediation has 3 different things in it. One is app stores, which are represented there by Google Play and Apple's App Store. Those are the only 2 app stores. Then there's e-commerce, and that's Meta's Marketplace, Amazon's Marketplace, and Google Shopping. And then Google Maps is a bit of a just on its own in there. So those are 3 different kinds of intermediation, but otherwise we have social networks. Interestingly, TikTok's in social networks and not in video sharing. There's video sharing, there's search. Only one entity in each of those. There's messaging. Apple's iMessage was determined to be too small or not have enough business users. So that's why it's just the Meta messaging. Then there's advertising. Google, of course, on the open web. Amazon and Meta on their own sites. 2 browsers. And then 3 operating systems, of which really 2 are of great interest, which are the mobile operating systems. So those are all the core platform services. And the way to think about the DMA is there are 22 rules. You can put the rules across the top, put the core platform services down the side, and every core platform service has to obey each of the 22 rules. Okay. What's interesting about that is that the 22 rules are clearly, when you look at them, written for certain platforms. Like you must allow a competing app store is a rule for a mobile operating system. It's not a rule for a search engine or mapping. But yet, the search engines and the maps have to comply with it. So every platform must comply with all 22 rules. And it's hard to write rules that don't have unintended consequences in the off-diagonal spots, so to speak. But I think they've done a pretty good job about that. We could debate it. But I think that's the live issue. So these are the rules as you see them on this slide. Let me just get them so that I can see them on my slide. Okay, we have here a number of types of rules. I think the data-related ones, some of these duplicate the DMA because the DMA wasn't being enforced because the Irish Data Protection Authority is captured by the firms that are located in that jurisdiction. So there's some duplication there, but interestingly, data portability is mandated, and it has to be real time so that you can get your data out of a platform, your personal data, in real time. Commercial relations is a very important one. Here we have a ban on MFN clauses, a ban on platforms prohibiting app developers from steering, a reader rule. That means that every app developer is permitted to distribute an app that's empty through the App Store and let you fill it with content that you buy somewhere else. Gag clauses are the things that prohibit an app developer from telling you that the content is available somewhere else for less, for example. Mobile ecosystems is important because here is where we have the requirement to have third-party app stores and side loading. Interoperability is also extremely important. 6.7 is the rule that says that one of the a core platform service must allow rivals providing software or hardware access to the very same APIs that they themselves use. So think about Apple Music in competition with Spotify. The attributes that the APIs that Apple Music is linking to have to be available to Spotify in the same way, or think about a wearable like a watch. Okay, same APIs must be available for no charge. The last thing I'll say is transparency. The ad tech stack is really not addressed much by the DMA except transparency. So everyone's going to be able to get tools, and the publishers and the brands are going to be able to have tools that allow them to verify that they're being charged the monopoly price and given the monopoly quality, but not much else besides notice that. So that's a quick overview of what the DMA does, and we'll just leave this up while we're chatting.
Yeah, that's and sorry, I started in automatic mode, and I forgot to say that Nicolas Petit was also supposed to be here, and unfortunately he couldn't make it. He couldn't travel, so we're very sorry to miss him. I'm going to do my best during my moderation to try to impersonate him and try to push you more on what exactly innovation is trying to deliver on the DMA. So we're sorry that Nicolas, they're not here. No, he's listening to us online. So let's start. Elettra, you have the first short remarks, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Yes.
How do you see innovation in the DMA?
Great. So I have other slides, but then we can come back to those very helpful slides. So I guess thanks. Well, first I want to say thank you so much, Filippo and Luigi, for inviting me and for organizing this great conference every year. It is such a pleasure to be here. I am happy to follow Fiona because I don't have to go through the pillar and what the DMA is, and I can just jump to what I want to talk about, which is a few kind of attempts at situating the DMA historically and conceptually in the moment that we are currently in. I'm going to try and move slides. Okay, so shameless self-promotion. I recently wrote a paper about pro-competitive regulation aimed at a US legal audience, but broadly this paper was about the DMA secretly. And I am going to take 3 points from that paper, and I think these will be helpful to our conversation today. So the first thing to say is how does the DMA fit within a broader kind of historical arc of the evolution of regulatory efforts in digital markets? So many of you in this room will know that in the last 30 years, we've moved from a decentralized internet of networks to a more centralized internet of platforms. With this evolution, we've seen renewed calls for legal regulatory renovation and intervention. And so we can understand the emergence of regulatory instruments like the Digital Markets Act and like other regulatory frameworks like the Digital Services Act or the AI Act in Europe. But also we can understand the existing anti-monopoly movement in the United States as part of this evolution over the last 30 years. So this is just a sort of a diagram that illustrates this particular evolution in the case of Google. I'm not going to go through all of the details here, but we might discuss Google in more detail later. Suffice to say that early on, Google was broadly unregulated. There have been a few attempts at accounting for Google's market power. The DoubleClick merger was examined by the FTC in 2007 and was cleared. One interesting aspect of that, of the statements of commissioners in that case, was the reluctance of antitrust officials to scrutinize privacy-sensitive aspects, right? And to basically say, we are only concerned with competition. We are not concerned with privacy harms. And so we're not going to look at this merger between a huge ad tech player and a huge search engine. And we're not really going to consider the effects on consumers that this merger might entail down the line. So that's just an example. There's obviously been a Google search case that was started in the 2010s, but never went to court. And obviously today we have a very different situation with many, many cases in ad tech and search markets against Google. And in Europe, we have the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, the Data Governance Act, GDPR, and a variety of other regulatory instruments. So this is how we can understand the evolution historically. Now, moving to a more conceptual question, how do we understand what DMA is doing in digital markets? I think it can be helpful to sort of map the DMA in this chart. So the chart has two axes. The first, the x-axis goes from decentralizing to centralizing interventions in markets. So you can understand decentralizing efforts as efforts to diffuse market power, to create or enable a plurality of actors to compete on the market. And centralizing efforts instead are more concerned with regulating incumbents, making bottlenecks more accountable. And the y-axis goes from ex ante to ex post efforts. And obviously these distinctions are normative and contested. So I'm just positing those distinctions as part of this exercise of mapping what's going on. Ex ante efforts being structural, more long-lasting efforts that aim at regulating, governing, structuring markets in a more durable way, ex post efforts being attempts at addressing harm in ad hoc ways once the harm has manifested in markets, right? So the textbook understanding of antitrust law tends to place antitrust in the decentralizing ex post quadrant. When I say tends to, I agree that there are lots of people, including scholars, policymakers, who would contest that antitrust actually falls within the decentralizing ex post side of this quadrant. But there is a tendency to see antitrust as a decentralizing ex post tool that is court enforced, that is case by case, and that relies on remedies that will be imposed on specific firms and not a market as a whole. On the other hand, if you think about utility, traditional public utility regulation, there is a tendency to understand public utility regulation as having a centralizing effect on markets, as somehow taking incumbents and bottlenecks for granted, or as entities that will remain where they are, and therefore imposing certain public interest requirements and burdens on these actors, entry-exit barriers, fairness, non-discrimination obligations, and other price controls. So what is going on right now? We are moving both from the antitrust perspective and the regulatory perspective toward the decentralizing ex ante side of the frame. So we are seeing efforts like the Digital Markets Act, which focus on contestability and fairness, which seek to regulate digital markets in a structural way, seek to impose obligations on big tech firms, bottlenecks, right? We could call big tech firms bottlenecks, so as to enable more competition, so as to enable a variety of different actors to compete with these big tech firms on a variety of different market segments, right? So that's what the DMA is aiming to do. But what's interesting to me for a US audience is that I think we could interpret a lot of what's going on in the antitrust space as also an attempt to move antitrust towards a more structural approach to enforcement. So thinking more preemptively about the effect of antitrust remedies, antitrust enforcement on longer term, the longer term kind of livelihood of digital markets. One last thing I want to say before I pass the mic on is, so the third, I think, learning point takeaway from this recent work I've done on pro-competitive regulation is what can we learn about the limits of regulatory instruments like the Digital Markets Act. And I have a lot to say, and I think we can talk about this more later. But I think one of the fundamental limits of the Digital Markets Act is a faith in individual preferences, choices, the ability to switch, and a faith in the ability of markets, of competitive markets, to actually produce the types of digital goods that we want to see in our future, right? So we are relying on the goodwill of nice Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and perhaps European entrepreneurs to create the kinds of search engines, the kinds of marketplaces, the kinds of apps that we really want in our future. I'm not sure that that's, necessarily optimistic. I am not so faithful in the goodwill of those market actors. And I actually believe that the vision of innovation that we should push for is thinking more about what kinds of goods we want, what kinds of search engines, what kinds of social media companies, etc. I'll leave it here.
Thank you very much. Maria Luisa, you have the floor next.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I think I could spend my entire preliminary remarks on your last 2 points, Elettra, but I'll take it for the discussions. Let me start by thanking Filippo and the organizer for inviting me. And let me say out loud that I'm delighted to be here for a specific reason, apart from the fact that this is a very inspiring conversation. The reason is that I'm a competition lawyer by background, I'm a competition scholar, but I work for a free speech organization, so for a human rights organization. And the majority of the times that there are political economy discussions or competition discussions, human rights organizations are not necessarily a voice in this debate. So it is a delight to be included in these discussions. And I have to say that on this perspective, I think that in the European Union, as well as in the US, we've gone a long way already. A few years ago, that was pretty much unthinkable. But the reality is, when I try in my daily job to protect or suggest measures to protect free expression and media freedom or media plurality online, what I do, I look at the behavior of the big platforms that dominate this space. And many of these behaviors and many of these business models are actually within the scope of the Digital Markets Act. So there you go, 1 + 1, 2. I think it's a very good signal that this is increasingly recognized, and I think it's also a good signal that at this conference today, it's not going to be only me. I've seen from the program that it's going to be a colleague from Electronic Frontier Foundation speaking. So I think this is is a message per se, and I endorse this message. Obviously. The DMA and innovation, I think that was the title of these discussions. It's indeed a pity that Nicola cannot be with us. I know he has quite some ideas about what kind of innovation in the DMA we can expect from the DMA. And I am delighted that Elettra, you already said, maybe we need good innovation, and is the DMA enough? My 2 cents on this, I do believe that the DMA, although it doesn't qualify explicitly what kind of innovation, you use the term innovation every now and then, but it doesn't say which kind of innovation, yet it gives some quite straightforward and clear hints and indications for 2 reasons. One, we can get indication from the text of the DMA, and another one from the fact that it doesn't happen in a vacuum, but there is an entire architecture. So let's look at the text of the DMA. There are here and there a number of indications, I would say, that the kind of innovation the DMA is trying to promote is an innovation that disrupts the gatekeeper value chains rather than sustain the gatekeeper value chain. There are a number of recitals that usually explain the meaning of the different articles, and one that I want to point at is recital 72 that talks about, make reference to the business model of the gatekeeper when it comes to data collection and data processing, and it says, we need to avoid that deprofiling becomes the industry standards. And it explains that the DMA provisions, in this case, recital 72 refers to transparency provisions that Fiona mentioned, should allow other undertakings to come into the market and bring in different value propositions. So as you can see, there are here and there. This is one example. There are other examples. They hint at other undertakings, different value propositions. So I do argue that this is not the kind of innovation that sustains the actual value chain, but challenges the actual the existing value chain. Another point, as I mentioned, the DMA doesn't happen in a vacuum. We have the treaties that point specifically at the single market, the internal market, as one of the main objectives of the entire exercise, the entire EU architecture and dream and vision. And we don't need to go farther than Article 3 of the Treaty of the European Union to say the goal is highly competitive social market economy. So this is what we're aiming at, and this is what the DMA, which is based on Article 114 of the treaties, which is the internal market provision. So the main goal is to look at internal markets and help to build this internal market. This is the declaration. Now I want to bring in another instrument that I'm not sure everybody's going to be familiar with, but in December 2022, the presidents of the Commission, the European Parliament, and the European Council, they signed a declaration on digital rights and principles for the digital decade. Now, it's not a binding exercise, far from that, but it gives some hints on what are the values and principles that the 3 institutions they need to sort of implement and look at when we talk about the digital markets and premise. And if we look at this document, there are very clear indications, and I'm quoting. So it says, the key points are putting people at the center of the digital transformation, point 7. Another one is we need a model for digital transformation that strengthens the human dimension of the digital ecosystems with the internal market at its core. And then there is a specific reference to research and innovation. It says special attention should be given to the small and medium enterprises and startups. So I do recall this is not a binding instrument, but it's a declaration of principles and values, so it gives their direction. So what we have is we need to contribute to the social market economy. We need to put people at the center, empower people, and that's what you have hinted at, and I think it's going to be a nice discussion afterwards. Respect the fundamental rights and values of the EU treaties. And then come especially for SMEs and startups. So this is not about, I think all this gives an indication about plurality and diversity in value propositions, demand-driven innovation. I do close, and then I have, I'm going to bring a little bit more discussions and meat to this user empowerment argument that I've briefly raised. I want to close by saying I do believe that in Europe, well, in general, but especially in Europe, in the internal digital market, we have an innovation gap to be filled. And the innovation gap has been consistently created by the behaviors of the gatekeepers. We can look at many, many examples. I just mentioned a few that everybody's going to be familiar with. So WhatsApp in 2012, 2013, 2014 was a serious competitive threat. It was supposed to be, or it could have been, the first mobile-only social media network. It has been brought by Facebook. How many changes have we seen in the WhatsApp service in a decade? Well, they've changed the privacy conditions, and this has meant that many people, they've shifted to Signal overnight, collapsing the server, by the way, but so this is the kind of innovation we've seen, no more than that. There were possibilities for Twitter users to add some plugins and set timers. My time is over. There is not this possibility anymore. I don't know what the counterfactual would have looked like. We had discussed this yesterday a lot. What I do know is why we didn't get there, and the response is always the same. We didn't get there because someone took this possibility off the table by buying the possible threats or by changing the IPA in a way that could have not allowed this innovation anymore. So yeah, this is the scenario we'll look at. Happy to discuss afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fiona, you're next.
Okay, I think I have slides. Thank you, Rachel. I changed them and Rachel is rescuing me. I'll just start by saying I want to build on these, actually both of these ideas about the ex-ante nature of the regulation and the desire for more plurality and diversity, and the desire to get that plurality and diversity by encouraging innovation on the other side of the platform, the business user side of the platform. And when the platform takes all the rents, what you end up with is not insufficient incentive on the part of the business user to innovate. And moreover, when the platform is concerned that the business user might innovate in a way that will eventually become a threat to the platform itself, then the platform has strong incentives to control exactly what the business user is doing. Okay, so how are we doing on getting up my deck?
The updated one won't.
Just use the old one. That's fine. That's fine. Doesn't matter. So I wanted to also to tie this discussion back to what I talked about yesterday, which is the idea of competition in the market. And when we have new economy markets and we have very strong network effects and economies of scale, we really aren't going to tend to get this. There are not going to be 10 search engines going at once. Instead, we have competition for the market, who's going to become the monopoly search engine. But competition for the market is actually very inefficient. Why? Because we need to have it with some regularity, and the timing of the new monopolist is uncertain. The switching costs of the consumers have to be borne by the consumers. They all need to switch together, and the coordination cost is difficult. Moreover, an entrenched platform can easily defeat competition for the market because they can acquire nascent and potential competitors. They can make strategic choices over interoperability. They can guide the innovation of the complements on the platform and so forth. Policing competition for the market with limited resources is basically impossible. And we're going to get this once-in-a-generation shift after an expensive, contentious, and late antitrust case, as we saw yesterday. So what the DMA tries to do is set up markets in a way to achieve competition in the market. And how does that work? Well, you you make an interface and you create a right to that interface for the business user. And the right to that interface achieves two things. One, you can invest, knowing you won't be cut off. And two, you will not be, you know that you won't be discriminated against. So this idea, the idea of this interface is that it's going to fix the lack of innovation by both gatekeepers, because it's going to put a little bit more competitive pressure on them, so they might have to improve things every so often. And then importantly, by the business users themselves, because it addresses their fears about future expropriation. So the business user can not only innovate and grow, but then, as I said, possibly create competition for the platform itself at a future time. That interface shouldn't unduly constrain innovation by these parties if you've designed it correctly. So why might that be true? Well, you don't restrict how the platform writes its code or what it does underneath the interface, and you don't restrict what the business user does on top of the interface, and they can morph themselves into another core platform service, for example. The second goal of the DMA is fairness on top of contestability. Network effects means that much of the pie goes to the gatekeeper, and the users, for example, of Facebook would get just as much utility out of another social network if they could all move there together. They care about each other. They don't really care about the exact format of the graphical user interface. So let's say they keep 97% of the surplus if they move to a rival to Facebook altogether. But because they have a coordination problem, they can't do that. So Facebook takes 97% of the surplus. So what this law is trying to do is create different outside options for business users so that they have better methods, better outside options, and therefore better bargaining power with respect to the gatekeeper. And some of those methods are, for example, giving the business user a way to disintermediate the gatekeeper entirely so that they get access to the network effects without giving up the rents. And this, again, feeds back into the innovation issue that I talked about above. There's a couple of aspects of the DMA that I want to just close with, which are not about innovation so much, but about the practicality, which I think for Americans we immediately think of. How are the almost unlimited resources of the gatekeeper going to be prevented from delaying this for just years and years with process? Look at the GDPR, for example. One answer is gatekeepers are defined by size. So there's no litigation over whether somebody has market power, over whether it's a two-sided market, or any of those other issues. The asymmetric information of the gatekeepers and their ability to get around a regulation is dealt with by requiring that the law says you have to achieve contestability and fairness, and more or less, we don't care much how you do it. So you're responsible for designing your access solution. It has to be effective for the business user to get on and have their third-party app store. So the technical aspects of how you design that third-party app store are not really covered in the law. The burden of showing that the third-party app store or whatever it might be is achieving contestability and fairness lies with the gatekeeper. Once a year, they have to turn in a compliance report saying, here's what I did, and here's why it achieves contestability and fairness. You might say the pace of technological change is fast, so the DMA could be out of date quickly. I'll say that it has a couple of provisions in it that allow it to self-update, and we might come back to that. And you might further say, well, if you try to regulate something too early, you'll be wrong in the way you do it. These 22 rules might be wrong. The core platform services that are covered here are pretty old. I mean, Google search has been basically the same. Well, it's gotten worse, but otherwise it's been basically the same for 15 years. Mobile operating systems are the same. E-commerce is the same. We're not dealing with issues here that are somehow breaking. So I think that whole setup makes me feel cautiously optimistic about the possibility that this will work, and whether it will stimulate the right kind of innovation really does depend on the business users. I don't think it depends on goodwill of business users. I think it depends on profit of business users, because once you have access to consumers, which you get by right through your interface, you can then make money. So then you want to come in and have a business. But it's necessary for the business users to turn up, because remember, the compliance is effective. It has to be effective. Well, who knows whether it's effective? Only the business user. The law does not say, do these 17 things in your code. It says, make it effective. So if there's no business user, you can't figure out whether it's effective or not. So the law is not going to actually do anything unless the business users turn up.
Thank you. Ahead of time, 1 minute ahead of time. That's perfect. So that's great. This is all very enlightening. So let's start by starting on a topic that all of you mentioned, which is what type of innovation exactly the DMA is trying to promote, right? Do you all agree that there's a focus on this, like just increasing rivalry and a focus on business to business innovation, business users? Are consumers as part of the innovation chain forgotten in the DMA? And why is this not a loss for the innovation ecosystem overall? So I don't know who.
Should I?
Okay. I do believe that. So you ended up by saying we can have all this architecture, but if business users they don't show up, then we're not going to go anywhere. And I've had a lot of conversations with the regulators when I was discussing the how we can stretch a couple of obligations in the DMA, making a number of things possible. For example, as civil society, we've been advocating all along the negotiation for a stronger degree of interoperability, not only for instant messaging, but also for other key services in the social media networks, et cetera, many times the pushback has been there is no demand. Users, they don't want this. Otherwise, they would have said so. And my reflection is, How can I say so if I have no possibilities, nowhere else to go, if I have no choice? If there is no choice in the market, you're not going to know from the outside what do I want or what do I don't want. And I do believe that this passive condition is something that has been very artificially and professionally created along the past 10, 15 years. So users have been made passive on purpose. But I do believe that the demand is there. And one of the signals that we have pretty clear, although we do need more evidence, and by all means, the researcher community should and could help on that, is that when a little bit of innovation has been brought into the table, there has been quite a pickup. But then, changes in the IPA or a lot of mergers, they have just flattened the environment again. So I do believe that this architecture, this full list of obligations could be and should be interpreted holistically as a way to enable business cases. Because the demand is there. I am genuinely convinced the demand is there. Now, this is linked to the enforcement of the rules, which has also been mentioned, and the fact that the gatekeeper, they need to show that they've been compliant and they have effectively implemented some of the rules. Now, the key point, which we are discussing a lot in Europe, is what are the benchmarks for this compliance? When this compliance is effective, when we can say it has led to contestability and fairness. If we want to focus and keep focusing on the demand, then I would say in the assessment, we need to look at the end users much more than I see happening in the current discussion. Do surveys, do A/B testing, make them, encourage them, and especially for the regulators, go and talk with end users, organizations, with civil society. Do not stop at what the gatekeepers tell.
But I think the problem is the end users don't have much to say till the business user comes in. So I 100% agree with you, but it's a bit like step 2. At step 1, get some businesses in there. Step 2, ask the consumers how they like it.
Or maybe we can agree on a step 1, which is complex and has 2 layers. Bring the business users in, but make sure that they comply with what the demand is asking.
So Fiona, do you agree with this business-to-business preference, and you think there's not a laws in kind of not having consumers that much place into the discussion?
Well, let me say there's a companion piece of legislation called the Digital Services Act, and the quick way to think about that for this group is it's the quality provision. So it says you cannot provide a bad quality product. Like you cannot put a car on the market with no brakes and no airbags. Okay. And the reason that that's important is if you're going to engender competition, you need that competition to not be a race to the bottom to a car with no brakes. So you include some rules about what social media can do and what digital things can be online that are safe. And then you try to unleash the competition.
What do you think?
Yeah, so I think, what the question was, what is the vision of innovation that is embedded in the DMA? I think there's a vision of innovation, and there's also a vision of innovation that is not embedded in the DMA, which I think is the interesting part to discuss. So I do believe, and I think I agree with Fiona's general view on the DMA that the aim is to create more innovation in tech markets that are highly concentrated. And it's true, it seems extremely correct to me that what has happened over the last over the last decade is further consolidation and not that much innovation around these bottlenecks, right? So if you allow the internet to consolidate around a few platforms, those platforms will unlikely want to let other actors and competitors enter the market and challenge them. And so what the DMA is doing is it's creating the possibility for these challenges. And I believe that that's a really important thing. What the DMA isn't doing, so first of all, it isn't necessarily making it easy for platforms to create, for entrepreneurs to create new platforms, right? And so there's this kind of competition for or in the market, the competition for the platform economy has potentially become less easy to access, right? Because now
it
there's
wasn't happening. That would be my argument before. So
yeah, exactly. But if one kind of has this rosy picture of an economy that is dynamic, that changes, potentially Google one day will become obsolete, some other company will emerge. What happens under a DMA is that every gatekeeper is, liable or has to comply with a bunch of obligations. The European Commission will monitor the compliance with these obligations, and so it becomes a regulated industry.
Although, I do think it's a reasonable thing to say that a business user on top of that regulated platform could turn itself into a new platform. And that thing is not regulated, right? Because until it gets to a big size, there's no rules. So, in that way, maybe it does make it easier to enter.
Yeah, so I think the size thresholds are useful because it's true that companies have to achieve a certain size before they get regulated. And so in that sense, one could say there is still a possibility to create new platforms. But the argument that, Europeans won't want to build platforms because it won't actually be profitable to do so is a potential argument. I'm just voicing that argument. And then the other, vision of innovation that the DMA is not advancing is what I was saying before, this idea of perhaps innovation is about deciding what kind of digital economy we want or, what things we need. So it's not just about letting market actors operate in a regulatory vacuum, but it is a normative question of how do we advance an economy that continues to push new good things for consumers, new possibilities that actually will create a more valuable society, right? So if we have more and more innovation, but a society that is less and less, say, happy in welfare terms, then what are we doing with our innovation? Like, what is innovation for, I guess, is my question.
Thank you. So let's try to make this more concrete with two questions, and then we're going to open for Q&A, so start thinking about your questions. So two specific examples, right? So about market structure, and that's me impersonating Nicolas. So Nicolas has a book saying the basic called the oligopoly scenario, where it says that most of the competition that happens in big tech markets is not new entrants challenging big platforms, is big platforms going from their core services and then entering a new market and challenging the other big platform and another new market. And so let's think about the case of Twitter, right? Elon Musk buys Twitter, changes the platform. Some people like it, some people hate it. Meta sees an opportunity and launches Threads as a direct competitor, right? Try to innovate on this market. It doesn't launch it in Europe because we can discuss whether it's right or not, because it says that the DMA kind of blocks it from leveraging its Instagram network effects into the new Threads market. So you have a clear case of like a new market, a potential new entrant who's innovating that's blocked because the platform cannot do like offensive attack on it. So is this a loss for innovation or not? And isn't it like naive to expect that basically you're always going to have innovation coming from a small guy and not from this like extension of platform services? Yeah. How do you see that?
I think, so I'll just say my heart is not bleeding for anybody, Europeans who don't get Threads. They'll be fine. But more generally, of course, I think that this is an issue. I would say that focusing on Threads might be a little bit narrow in the sense that the DMA allows it's much easier for Amazon to start a search engine and get it onto a choice screen, and for, in general, anybody to start shopping and e-commerce and all of the platforms that want to move into each other's spaces are enabled in the same way that any other business user is enabled on the rival platform. So I think there's more loosening up than tightening down. But also, it's very important that the law enables business users, because it's not clear to me how much these large platforms have an incentive to invade each other's territory. All that's going to happen, potentially, is that there's a consequence the other direction, and everybody's happier with some mutual forbearance and generally staying out of each other's markets. So you wouldn't want to build a law that was entirely based on big platforms entering against each other. Let me, I have a specific example just to respond to your question that's app stores, which I think is very helpful and goes to this imagination problem that Maria Luisa was talking about. If you don't know what you don't have, it's really hard to ask for it. So Apple says, we all love our app store. What's wrong with it? We thought of it. It's the best that could possibly be. But I mean, back when we all had Comcast and had to pay $120 a month for really bad television services, were we imagining Disney, Hulu, Netflix, BritBox, Apple TV, all those things? No, we were not. There was not a great outcry about how the TV was bad. I think it's the same with app stores. I mean, if you thought about what developers could do under the DMA, you could have app stores that compete on price, less than 30%, which the gaming industry would like very much. You could have app stores that competed on curation. There's more than 1 million apps in the App Store. I don't want that. I want like a tasteful app store. Could someone please enter with just tasteful apps? Or apps that help me lower my carbon footprint, the scooter or the food delivery or whatever it is that has a lower carbon footprint. Or how about a children's app store that just has really, really safe content? And if you're going to give an iPhone to an 8-year-old, you take off the regular app store and put on the children's app store. Or how about an app store that's more secure? Even Apple's app store has hacks and bad stuff in it. You could have a very security conscious app store. You could have the Belgian government could put all the apps you need to access government services and rubbish collection and pay your taxes into a store, and that would be easy to find. What about payment innovation? The American Express Platinum Store. Everybody here, I'm sure, would love that. It's going to be an app store where you pay for everything with your American Express card. It has apps for rich people and people who travel. And if there's promotions like buy 2 tickets to the US Open and get a free glass of champagne if you buy it with through the American Express App Store, it'd be fantastic. Newspapers could run a co-op. They could create a store, and instead of charging 30%, they could charge themselves 3% or whatever the cost of the store was, and we could buy subscriptions there, or maybe buy articles one at a time, for example, because there'd be innovation to facilitate new ways of selling news to people. Then there's technological innovation. Epic has been quite vocal about wanting a metaverse, and I don't know that's involved, but there's that kind of direction. So these rules, 6.7 that requires functionality, side loading, MFNs being prohibited, gag orders being prohibited, third-party app stores happening, create a possibility of tremendous innovation that makes our handsets much more useful. I'll just close by saying that the number of apps that users have been downloading onto their handsets over the last few years has been going down. When you think about how many more opportunities there are to do cool things with your handset and an app, that's going up. Why are downloaded apps going down? Because we can't find what we want, because it's one giant store with all kinds of junk in it, and what they advertise to me is nothing I'm interested in. So it's obviously just a bad distribution channel, and I think if we allow this kind of innovation, it would get better. And
Fiona, can we move?
I will stop.
Yeah,
I'll leave that up.
I'll ask Isa, and so what do you think of threats? Is there laws? Is not a laws? How do you think about this?
So I do believe I'm still trying to figure out where I stand in this specific conversation. But when it comes to so my wonders are, is this very much an innovative move? And is this adding and bringing added value into the markets, and especially so for the people? So what I see is that we have a gatekeeper that at some point has decided to come in and with a new product, in brackets, a new product that is bundled with a product that they already offer on the market, because one of the main difficulties of offering Thread on the European market was that it was tied up with Instagram profiles, and that was not allowed by the DMA anymore. So they had to slow down, stop, think about it, change slightly their business model, and say, okay, if we want to launch it on the European Union market, then we need to sort of untie this from an existing service, because this is what the DMA is not allowing us to do anymore. So when I think about this, I see bundling there as also a leveraging market power from one place to another. And also there is an additional point, which is Thread is thinking to use a protocol that is used now by one of the possible alternative to the traditional social media networks in Europe. So there is an element of free riding as well there, which I as I said, I need to sort of make my mind out of it yet, talking possibly with technologies and see what are the pros and cons of this possibility. So I don't think this is the kind of innovation that we really want to see. This is more a business strategy to entrench a power position.
Yeah, I think the challenge that I'll get to is that like if you have very strong network effects, the main way to challenge it is you already have network effects on another product, and try to kind of face network effects one against each other, and then you can increase contestability. So how do you see that, Elettra? Do you think that threads is a loss or not?
No, I completely agree with Maria Luisa. I first of all, I just don't see the value of threads other than just trying to fill a void of social media dismay at the moment. But so I actually don't understand what threads is. I was personally annoyed about
Twitter run by Mark Zuckerberg.
Right. But and I was personally annoyed about the fact that I do have an Instagram app on my phone, and that constantly I get these notifications. Your friends want to join threads, and there's all these ways in which when you want to share a post, it's basically trying to make you post on threads and like create an account in a very opaque way through dark patterns. So I do believe that this is a situation where a company is using their incumbent market power to force a user base into a new service. And so they're not competing fairly, right? And so if the DMA is operating in that way, I actually welcome that, right? I think Facebook can create an alternative social media app. They just need to get the user base in fair ways like everyone else. They can't rely on their existing Instagram and Facebook user base and just get a critical mass by sheer market power, right? So the DMA is operating according to plan if it prevents threads from operating in that way in Europe. So I am all for that. I guess, I don't know, you asked us for more examples?
No, I'll move to the next example, then we're going to open for questions. So the other parts that focus on business to business and not business to consumer relations has consequences for business to consumer relations, right? So let's think about search. So one of the goals of the DMA is to increase contestability by sharing click and query data. But the DMA at the same time tries to prevent self-preferencing in ranking services. And so one of the evolutions of search that we're seeing is that more and more you have universal search results. So you get a search and the results is already shown. And what you see as well is, for example, that more and more companies are just incorporating AI into search. You search something and immediately get the answer through AI. So does the DMA have a preference for like contestable blue links? And is this a loss because it's trying to promote business competition in a way that shapes the evolution of the consumer interface? Or wouldn't you agree with that? And you think that basically like the DMA is not going to have something to say about incorporating your own AI models into search results in a way that consumers seem to want, because that's what companies are doing?
Well, just say it's hard to know what consumers want. I mean, we have one search engine and it gives us things.
Oh, but like
And we
Bing
all
is an
click on the
entrance
first
trying
thing. So, I mean, I don't think you're learning very much from that.
But like I think that, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was saying, yeah, it is hard to know, but it might become a little bit easier if we sort of fully use some entry points that are in the DMA, in the rules of, because the DMA creates a lot of, at least three different regulatory dialogues. One is between Digicomp and the gatekeepers. The other one is between, Digicomp and the business users. And the third one is between Digicomp and the end users, because when the European Commission will come up with a preliminary conclusion on whether, the commitments that the gatekeeper will put in place to comply, whether they're sufficient or not, in practice, they can publish a non-confidential summary of those commitments and gather feedback from the other communities. And one of these communities is the end users. So it's difficult to know upfront what the consumers want, but there is a possibility to gather those feedback. Now, the point is, as an end user, I'm supposed to give feedback on based on a non-confidential summary of what Apple, Microsoft, Google, and so on, they want to do with regard to a specific service. So if there is not enough meat on that public document, how can I give meaningful feedback? And this happens when it's about the preliminary assessment. It happens when it's about assessing the compliance or non-compliance, when it's about figuring out if there are new services that might fall into the list or need to fall into the list of the core platform services or the behaviors that need to be regulated by the DMA. So what I'm trying to say is that in theory, the DMA has created some entry points, but depending on how much information will be given to the other communities that could contribute to an effective implementation of the rules, then we're going to get to completely different results.
I think you have to think about the multiple pieces of the DMA that affect search. So one loophole in the DMA is that it does not say anything about ads. So if you're going to be a search engine that just monetizes the whole first page, you can do what you like. The non-self-preferencing is about organic results. So I'm going to have some organic results that have to be in some order of consumers want them. But if those are on page 2 and the whole first page is monetized, then it's completely open. Now, that entirely monetized first page might therefore not serve users' needs very well because it's being chosen to maximize profit. That's where the choice screen comes in. So there's a choice screen that you'll get if you live in Europe between your Android operating system and Chrome, and between Chrome and the search engine. And if you're an Apple user, it'll be between iOS and Safari, but Safari will come probably with Google search built in for $36 billion or whatever it is. That choice screen then creates the possibility that if somebody invents an AI engine that actually isn't monetized and is giving you something, therefore something you want, rather than something that is enriching somebody else, you might want to use it. And then you could pick and install it. Defaults can be changed very easily according to the DMA. So with a couple of clicks, you could switch to the new exciting search engine if that's what you want to do. Will that cause contestability in search engines? Not right away, because usage causes quality, which causes more usage. And right now we're in a steady state with Google search. But if there's some kind of technological shock that comes along, there's the possibility that it could be adopted in Europe, whereas in the United States, there just really isn't. So that I think it's medium. I would say a thing that might be helpful on ads is the 669 that lets you have your personal data be fed in an automated fashion to somebody else. So perhaps I search on Google Search or on Amazon, and then my personal data, I arrange to have it sent to my ISP and I get a discount off of my internet service at my house, or I get a discount off of a newspaper or something. Essentially, I would sell access to my data instead of just to Google and Amazon. I would get something for it from everybody else, and they would then have the same understanding that I'm shopping for shoes or that I like pizza or whatever it might be. And that would a little bit level this playing field that you were talking about, instead of a platform being the only one with data and selling valuable ads. There'd be others with that valuable data that could sell ads.
All right. Do you want to say something? Otherwise, we can open for questions as well. So if you have questions, please raise your hand. And I see already one.
I just wanted to say.
You say something. You can give it to Laura. The mic and the
I don't necessarily want to add anything to what was said. The only, I guess, one kind of puzzle I have is this kind of business to consumer versus business to business. And I can't believe that I'm the one defending the DMA here, but I actually think it's fine to have a regulatory instrument that is primarily concerned with the interests of businesses, right? And business to business relations, and not necessarily, doesn't go to consumer protection issues. And there are other ways in which legal systems protect consumers and individuals and citizens that might not have to fall under the DMA. So in that sense, I'm open to that. And I just wanted to say this question of measuring individual choices or individual preferences, or whether individuals are happy about a given search engine versus another search engine. I also want to, not rely so much on individuals and their perceptions in an economy where our perceptions are constructed by intermediaries in significant ways. And and this is very meta potentially for this audience, but taking a step back from, understanding individual preferences in a vacuum and kind of trying to question how our preferences are formed. I was recently at a conference on addictive technologies. We are all embedded in technological ecosystems that shape our behaviors, shape our preferences, shape our choices in pretty pervasive ways. They might not affect our exact preference regarding, whether to have coffee in the morning, but they definitely make it harder for us to opt out from a platform and opt into another platform. And so creating more choices, relying on individuals to switch can be a very slippery slope exercise in my view.
Okay, so we're open to questions. So let's have two questions at a time, and questions are short, so 30 seconds max. So Laura, you start, please.
So this is, I think, mostly a question for you, for Fiona, but certainly open to other people's thoughts. Fiona, you opened with that slide that laid out all these different categories of offerings. And one really important business offering that has absolutely exploded is foundational models. Hundreds of thousands of businesses all over Europe, they are using foundational models to build their own models. And we're seeing many of the same behaviors. The up-and-comers are trying to design interfaces that are very easy to port over from other more established foundational models. And then there are the big guys who aren't. And so I'm curious if you thought about how this structure of thinking about gatekeepers might apply if the category is foundational models.
And let's just get Dennis' question that way.
Great. All this is great and very enlightening. But I think it very much depends on effective enforcement of the DMA. So I will shift slightly the focus there, and I'll be the public choice scholar in the room for a while. So I think that the DMA's architecture seeks very much to expand the discretion enjoyed by the Commission and to limit judicial review, right, to protect again the Commission. But does this come at the expense only of gatekeepers, or does it inadvertently harm the interests of business users, where if they are not happy or if the gatekeeper are not complying, there are very limited avenues for judicial avenues for redress. So public choice scholars come in and say, well, maybe these informal, consensual nature, negotiated outcomes of the DMA, the regulatory dialogue, does this increase the risk of regulatory capture? So that would be my question.
So Fiona, want to start
the short answer is no. I'm trying to wrap my head around what they're already regulating, and no one seems to understand AI yet. So I'm waiting for that to be done, and then I'll try harder there.
Anyone want to add something on foundational models or no?
I mean, so the DMA is pretty adaptable. The list of gatekeepers, who a gatekeeper is, what falls under the definition of a gatekeeper in a platform service is adaptable in time. And if some of these services start falling under those thresholds, it is possible that they will be, they will be caught by DMA. And then the question is whether, from a normative perspective, it's a good idea to enforce DMA-like obligations on a market that is still very much evolving. And I am not against it in the sense that I believe we're always making choices about what kind of innovation we want and what a new market looks like. And so the question is, how do we structure those new markets in ways that promote the right kinds of foundation models and the right kinds of AI applications?
The trick would be you'd have to open a market investigation, decide AI was in, and then if you add it, is that going to work with all 22 rules, right? Is the matrix going to get messed up somehow? So that would be someone should write a paper about that. But
Isa, do you want to say something about enforcement? So do you think that there's a big risk the Commission will be captured or not? And is the lack of judicial redress a problem?
Yeah, I don't have a specific answer to that. But also on the AI, just to give the full picture, the European Commission has recently opened a public consultation on AI and competition, which means they're actually looking at that. So we might get to the conclusion that they want to use the DMA as a possibility, or that they want to use Article 102, or that they want to use merger regulation. I think what we can hope is that they're going to do a very comprehensive market study before they decide, and then this is going to be for public discussion. So we'll see. On the regulatory capture, and so I think your main point is there is a lot of discretion. It's not arbitrary discretion, though. I think in any case, the DG Comp will need to stick with the principle of proportionality and necessity in the intervention. I just remind that, in the European framework, we have the Charter of Fundamental Rights that also attribute the fundamental rights to conduct a business. So their proportionality and necessity, they do play a role in whatever kind of decision DG Comp will make. Now, there is the possibility for regulatory capture. Well, you need to tell me if there is a possibility to get out from the regulatory capture at the moment. I don't think we have the culture of having a regulatory dialogue that is more participatory. Now, we're hearing voices in the US and in the EU about how to make antitrust a little bit more participatory, how to bring other voices in, and this can potentially reduce the possibility of regulatory capture by one group of stakeholders. Obviously, it's not easy. Obviously, it's a process, and it's not going to happen overnight. But I think, once again, that in theory, we need to work with what we have. The Digital Markets Act creates more possibility for other voices to be heard than the traditional competition tools. So let's focus on that, and let's see what we can get out of it.
I think regulatory capture is, a long way away. So it's always something to worry about. We have it here in the United States in spades. But the first month of the DMA has seen Apple and Google basically saying no and putting out plans that are blocking entry. Not only are they not contestable, they're actually blocking entry. So the first response of gatekeepers has been, we refuse to comply. So I don't think capture is really the first order problem at the moment. At the moment, is there rule of law in Europe or isn't there? Because it's, I think, not obvious at this point.
So I guess maybe I disagree a little bit. So one, I think there are two separate questions. I think there's a question of enforcement and there's a question of capture, which I believe are two separate questions. The way I interpret the whole umbrella of reforms in Europe, including the DSA, the DMA, the AI Act, and GDPR potentially as well, is they are very ambitious reforms that are meant to be under-enforced. So the way that European regulators are thinking about these is very much a sort of, we are gonna try and do the most we can in terms of imposing obligations, thinking about every possible way of regulating big tech. But that is not necessarily going to lead to effective enforcement in every case. We're going to focus on specific instances that we find particularly outrageous. We're going to create mechanisms of enforcement, but those mechanisms will necessarily be partial and limited, and we are all human, and therefore, and markets obviously evolve, and there are all sorts of opportunities for these businesses to actually get away with behavior that might actually be non-compliant. So I believe the framework and the intention is very much a sort of under-enforcement idea. However, I do think there is a way in which tech companies are pushing back against complying, and that is a threat. It is a threat because they have so much power. And I think Apple is a really interesting example of a company that is resisting the very purpose and aims of the DMA. Their business model is very much a sort of, walled gardens, secure services idea. And so the DMA and this kind of interoperability mentality very much opens up and, opens Apple apart. And so Apple has been complying recently, right? The DMA has entered into force or started being applied in March, and Apple started applying it, but it already said, basically, we will allow competing app stores to exist, right? Secure app stores can be interoperable with our users, or, our users will be able to access them. However, if you leave Europe for 30 days or more than 30 days, all of the apps that you downloaded from these app stores will never work again. So there is, somehow there is compliance, but tech companies can always use their control over infrastructure to, get away with it, basically.
So we have a question from someone who knows all about compliance, and if you have more questions, raise your hand, and we're happy to.
Yeah, so that actually goes to my question. Are these rules, having not seen the text, compatible with restricting to the European geography, or is it just going to be so tough to do that the gatekeepers will have to basically make these rules work worldwide?
And Giovanni?
Okay, thank you. Insightful conversation. My question is for Elettra. So from your presentation, my understanding is that you see the DMA as a tool, a regulatory tool toward decentralization. If I think of remedies such as interoperability, I think interoperability might lead to standardization, so to more centralization rather than decentralization. And I was interested in your thoughts.
Anyone wants to jump? It's interesting to say that Signal refused interoperability on messaging services, right? They say, we don't want that, actually.
Yeah, but they're
Leave
not
us alone.
regulated, so it's okay.
Yeah, it's fine.
Doesn't
But
matter.
I'm just adding spice
Yeah.
to the comment.
So quickly on this global thing, I think that's the $1 million question, well, the $1 trillion question that everybody keeps asking. For gatekeepers who are not impacted very strongly by the DMA, I think it makes sense to build one model and run it globally. So the rest of the world will get exported this regulation. If it's very expensive, then you're going to run an exploitative business model in the United States and a competitive one in Europe and make a lot more money in the United States. And then there's a question of how long that persists because the U.S. Congress can't legislate, or we like exploitative business models because we like making people in Silicon Valley really rich. Or whether there is some pressure because we can see the alternative to have regulation or actually just have the company decide to avoid regulation by rolling out the European model to the United States. And I think this creativity block, being able to see what the but-for world looks like because there's something happening in Europe that's working, is really for me the litmus test. Like if it works and there's fun app stores and digital wallets and things to do in Europe, that will have a big impact on the rest of the world. If it doesn't work because Apple refuses and the courts don't make Apple comply and kind of nothing happens, then of course it's not going to get exported.
So very quickly on interoperability, I just want to say one comment. I live in Switzerland, that beautiful island with mountains and cows, and we don't have any of the DMA app store. It's just not part of it. Like it's isolated. So interoperability very quickly.
Yes. Well, I think it's, we'll see. I don't think there's a clear answer either way. I think the aims of the DMA are to open up those markets to competition. Whether or not there will be competition might depend on enforcement. It might depend on how easy it is for consumers to switch. It might depend on whether it is even a plausible idea that consumers will switch if you give them the option to do so. That's a question for psychologists. I don't know if there are any in this room, but I really don't think that I can predict whether or not the DMA will work. I can only say this is the goals of the DMA, and this is how I see regulators thinking about it at this stage, I guess.
What do you think? You think interoperability will be used by the big guys to increase their market share, or is it going to be used by the small players?
I wouldn't exclude any possibility from the table at this stage. What I would like to add is that, first of all, interoperability is mandated on gatekeepers, but for the others is a possibility.
It's not.
So it's not that the DMA is trying to impose it on each and every player on the market. And indeed, Signal has made clear that they're not going to be interoperable for a number of reasons that they believe they're good reasons. So I think the fact that there is this possibility is going to create additional diversity and it's going to offer choices to people to pick what they prefer. And also, we need, I think, and I'm a lawyer by background, so I need to be careful about what I say here, but I think we need to stop thinking about interoperability as a black or white thing. It's a spectrum of possibilities, and there is a lot of room for experimentation in there. And I do believe that this is also one of the interesting work in progress of the DMA enforcement. So let's see where we get.
So very quickly, final two questions: Aaron, then Stefan, and then we wrap up.
So I just want to ask a question in terms of, from the perspective of having a falsifiable statement. So we've talked about the DMA not working possibly because of the companies not complying, but let's talk about the DMA not working because the DMA itself might be flawed. What would that look like? How would we actually look at the DMA and say, you know what, we thought this was going to make things better, but it actually made things worse? What would that look like so that we could self-check ourselves with this policy recommendation?
Mm-hmm. Stephanie?
So I think this follows up a bit on the last question. Would like to have your thoughts on, let's try to move 5 to 10 years forward. When, we live in a nice world where there's no self-preferencing, we'll have Fiona's, Platinum American Express App Store. And so, all the issues of Article 5 and 6 are solved. But, there will be technological innovation. So we may live in a world of, where AI plays an even bigger role, or where we may live in a world of the metaverse or whatever. So I'm trying to understand how we get from the current regulatory regime of 5 and 6 to a regime where 5 and 6 may be totally outdated. So do you think then we'll just have to relive the entire experience of creating the DMA, or we can just give this to the regulator? Any thoughts?
We'll quickly go down the line here. Start with Elettra and everybody give thoughts.
So what would it look like if the DMA ended up being flawed, or how do we recognize that state of affairs? I think if we realize that consumers are not switching at all, right? If there are lots of options, if the DMA is perfectly enforced, if it's very easy to switch and nobody's switching, that tells us something about humans, that requires different kinds of regulation for competition to exist in those markets. So that's maybe one part of the answer. In terms of what would it look like in 10 years' time if Articles 5 and 6 become obsolete, I think that's a really good speculative question. I guess one way of interpreting the DMA is actually the DMA is just meant to deal with the current state of affairs, which is a plausible way of understanding what's going on. It is addressing big tech companies as they currently exist, and perhaps it shouldn't be expanded into AI markets and other new segments because we don't know enough and we'll need adaptive regulation for that. I'm open to that perspective. I also think there needs to be some preemptive intervention or idea of how to orient innovation and the future of digital markets. Perhaps the DMA is not the tool, but we might want to think about something else then.
Going forward with the DMA and whether it becomes outdated, I think the hard truth simply is regulating digital markets is harder than regulating water and electricity. I mean, you just don't have to update your water regulation very often. And here the parliament is just going to have to deal with the fact that they're going to revisit this legislation when they decide it isn't working. So it's not a great answer, but I think that's just how it is. If the DMA is flawed, how would we know? That's hard because it goes to innovation that would have been invented but isn't, and we never know what that is. So the reason that you pass a law like this is because you think there's a balance of evidence saying that the business users are not innovating enough relative to the gatekeepers because of the threat of expropriation. The things that we wouldn't get, for example, would be Google not being able to remind me to leave on time for the airport because my map data can't be automatically combined with my email and my flight data because I didn't opt in. Well, if the service is really great, then Google should be able to send me an offer to opt in and I should be able to consent to that. So we'd be missing that innovation if the consumer really wanted it but didn't realize that they had to say yes, they wanted it, and therefore they were late for the airport. So these are the kinds of products that won't exist in that world. Other than things that we can see, the stuff that would be invented, we can't know. So we're going to have to just do a lot of work as industrial organization economists and study scholars of regulation and try to measure everything we can.
Lisa, very quickly, how would you say
Yes.
it has failed or not?
Very quickly. So on where we're going to be in 10 years from now, I think maybe, I agree, it's different from water and electricity. But I think, for example, in Europe, there's been this effort to liberalize telecom markets. And we started, years ago with a number of markets that were heavily regulated, and then step by step we decided, okay, there is enough competition, so we don't need to regulate this market anymore. And so there's been a progressive reduction of regulation. Maybe this is something that we could think of, looking at the different, core platform services. There will be others that will possibly need to be regulated, but let's see. And what if how the world look like if the DMA flows? I can only give an answer from the end user perspective, so the individual, the person. For me, it would be a big failure if in 10 years' time, I am still locked in with a gatekeeper, I'm exploited, and I have no choices to go to.
Thank you very much. This was a terrific discussion. Thank you.